with Florida Rising and Islami Simic, and also, of course, Conservation Florida and One Tree Planted. So thank you all for supporting and coming out to this project. Super excited for the next one. Everybody, it's Kristen here with Ideas for Us, and today we're doing an amazing project. We're planting 1,000 trees at D Ranch Preserve, which is a conservation area that was bought by Conservation Florida. We're going to be restoring this land with a lot of native trees to help heal the soil and the planet. And we are so thankful to One Tree Planted for supporting this project and so many other ones. We have a huge community group behind this one today with Florida Rising and Islami Simic, and also, of course, Conservation Florida and One Tree Planted. So thank you all for supporting and coming out to this project. Super excited for the next one. Everybody, it's Kristen here with Ideas for Us, and today we're doing an amazing project. We're planting 1,000 trees at D Ranch Preserve, which is a conservation area that was bought by Conservation Florida. We're going to be restoring this land with a lot of native trees to help heal the soil and the planet. And we are so thankful to One Tree Planted for supporting this project and so many other ones. We have a huge community group behind this one today with Florida Rising and Islami Simic, and also, of course, Conservation Florida and One Tree Planted. So thank you all for supporting and coming out to this project. Super excited for the next one. Everybody, it's Kristen here with Ideas for Us, and today we're doing an amazing project. We're planting 1,000 trees at D Ranch Preserve, which is a conservation area that was bought by Conservation Florida. We're going to be restoring this land with a lot of native trees to help heal the soil and the planet. And we are so thankful to One Tree Planted for supporting this project and so many other ones. We have a huge community group behind this one today with Florida Rising and Islami Simic, and also, of course, Conservation Florida and One Tree Planted. So thank you all for supporting and coming out to this project. Super excited for the next one. Everybody, it's Kristen here with Ideas for Us, and today we're doing an amazing project. We're planting 1,000 trees at D Ranch Preserve, which is a conservation area that was bought by Conservation Florida. We're going to be restoring this land with a lot of native trees to help heal the soil and the planet. And we are so thankful to One Tree Planted for supporting this project and so many other ones. We have a huge community group behind this one today with Florida Rising and Islami Simic, and also, of course, Conservation Florida and One Tree Planted. So thank you all for supporting and coming out to this project. Super excited for the next one. it's Kristen here with Ideas for Us, and today we're doing an amazing project. We're planting 1,000 trees at D Ranch Preserve, which is a conservation area that was bought by Conservation Florida. We're going to be restoring this land with a lot of native trees to help heal the soil and the planet. And we are so thankful to One Tree Planted for supporting this project and so many other ones. We have a huge community group behind this one today with Florida Rising and Islami Simic, and also, of course, Conservation Florida and One Tree Planted. So thank you all for supporting and coming out to this project. Super excited for the next one. Everybody, it's Kristen here with Ideas for Us, and today we're doing an amazing project. We're planting 1,000 trees at D Ranch Preserve, which is a conservation area that was bought by Conservation Florida. We're going to be restoring this land with a lot of native trees to help heal the soil and the planet. And we are so thankful to One Tree Planted for supporting this project and so many other ones. We have a huge community group behind this one today with Florida Rising and Islami Simic, and also, of course, Conservation Florida and One Tree Planted. So thank you all for supporting and coming out to this project. Super excited for the next one. Everybody, it's Kristen here with Ideas for Us, and today we're doing an amazing project. We're planting 1,000 trees at D Ranch Preserve, which is a conservation area that was bought by Conservation Florida. We're going to be restoring this land with a lot of native trees to help heal the soil and the planet. And we are so thankful to One Tree Planted for supporting this project and so many other ones. We have a huge community group behind this one today with Florida Rising and Islami Simic, and also, of course, Conservation Florida and One Tree Planted. On the Taylor Swift. All right. Are we good to go? Awesome. Hey friends, welcome. Everybody can grab a seat, grab a snack, grab a drink. I'm super excited to have you all here today. This is our last Hive of 2021, which is super exciting. This year has been absolutely crazy, as you all know, but we've been able to make really incredible impact despite all of these challenges that I'm excited that all of you have been a part of, and we're even more excited for another year of impact like this. So. Before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about who we are as an organization and what we're doing in the community. So as Ideas for Us, we are a global environmental nonprofit, and our mission is to develop, fund, and scale solutions that solve the world's most pressing environmental and social challenges. And how we do this is we work to educate individuals on environmental issues and engage them in developing ideas to solve global problems with local solutions. And then we mobilize them for boots on the ground action to combat this climate crisis. So we are taking part in the first step right now. We bring in an expert on a topic to talk about an environmental issue that aligns with one of the United Nations 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And then we take what we learned there and we come up with plans and ideas on how we can implement solutions. And then we carry out those solutions through our monthly eco action projects. And we don't just do one a month, we often do 5 to 7 to 10, depending on resources. So we like to focus on 5 different pillars of sustainability. Since climate change is a very multifaceted issue, we need to use all of these pillars in order to take an integrated approach. So we cycle between energy, water, food, waste, and ecology. And this allows us to have a lot of different diversity in the projects that we're doing. So we can do solar-powered workshops, urban agriculture programs like fleet farming, if you've heard of it. It's one of our main programs, waste audits, cleanups, tree plantings, shoreline restoration projects, and so much more. It's really based on the needs of the community and the ideas of you all in this room. And we do this because we believe that this information should be free and readily available to people. But not only just the information, we don't stop there. We also want to give people the opportunity to do something about climate change, because knowing about these issues really can bog you down. So we want to give you the opportunity to take hands-on action where you're planting something in the ground, seeing it make the difference that actually does make a really long-term impact. So this is just a little exciting slide that I wanted to bring up today. This is our impact from this year alone globally. We do have 12 branches internationally, and our international branches, most of them are in sub-Saharan Africa. They're absolute superstars. They plant 2,000 trees at a time, and it is so impressive. If you were there, you would have witnessed my first attempt at planting 1,000 trees. We did it. Shout out to the people who were there, but it was challenging. They do it 2,000 at a time, and it's amazing, but we're going to keep doing it. They inspired me to do that, and we're going to continue to do that work. So 3,124 pounds of waste collected or audited, 165 gardens installed. Most of that is local here in Orlando, thanks to our Edible Landscapes program, and a lot of them also in Africa and a lot of schools. 1,100 watts of solar energy used, thanks to the Do It in the Dark party with Caroline, 4,924 shoreline plants installed, and over 16,000 trees planted internationally. So that's super exciting. Really glad that we were able to do so much this year, thanks to the support of all you, and we're gonna have even more impact next year. So we're only able to do this because of our amazing supporters. So if you're able to, we have a Giving Tuesday fundraiser happening right now, and Facebook is doubling everything that is donated. So you can use that QR code, or when you go home, you can check it out on Facebook. All of our viewers, you can just click it right now. So please check that out if you're able to. But also just coming out to our events and coming right now is the best way to support us. So thank you all so much for being here. So now we're going to do a little icebreaker. Discuss this at your tables. What % of Americans fear that climate change will directly affect them? So you guys can take a second to go ahead and answer this question at your tables. Dang. Of the people who are aware of it. That helped double effect yet? Just throw out a number, 45%. Say 47. Okay. 45%. Your generation that is actually more scared than oh, that's still a lot. Yes. That a little bit helps.
It's actually because
How do you guys think that climate change directly affects? Like, what's like the biggest
Except Miami, we're gonna be right now, stronger hurricanes, we see stronger hurricanes, we're getting to Florida, we've seen that for the last 10 years.
I'm actually from South Florida, being from Fort Lauderdale over the years growing up, I've seen the shoreline from the beach go from here to the road. And my friends and family, people who.
All right. Do we think we know? Do we think we know? All right, let me hear y'all's answers. Someone from this table, what do you think? Ballpark.
The majority said what, 70?
60.
Okay. Interesting. Okay, that's a good guess. Nice, safe, and in the middle. What about you guys? 30%. I like the optimism there, guys. So while 61 believe it poses a threat or a risk, only 43% believe that it will directly affect them. That's a lot of privilege that we hold here in the United States, being like, oh, it's not really our problem. And I got this information from our incredible speaker today, Dr. Michael Gunter. He is a Cornell Distinguished Faculty at Rollins University. He's also an amazing author, publishing several books about climate change. His most recent one is Tales of Ecotourists. So a lot of diverse topics that he's covered, and we're super excited to have him here today. So let's give him a round of applause.
Thank you, Kristen, and thank you, Ideas for Us, for having me. And thank you for some students that have come too. I'm going to go through a lot of slides. Feel free to stop me if you have questions. and some of them I'll hesitate over more. Of course, we all have probably heard in the news about last month's Conference of Parties. That's what COP is short for. There were a few achievements there. I'm going to kind of lay the landscape of international agreements over the last quarter century plus, but end with an emphasis on what Ideas for Us does so well, and that is that the future of addressing climate change is at the local level. So, of course, international negotiations like those in Glasgow, and a few years before, as you recall, the Paris Accord, they have made some steps, which is much better than some of the first Conference of Parties. We've been having them, with the exception of last year, every year since 1995. That first Conference of Parties was in Berlin. I'm going to tell you about a couple of the more famous ones. The Paris Accord, of course, was famous because it did a much better job than some of its predecessors in terms of actually getting states to commit some resources behind this. The commitment was $100 billion to developing states. They've come far, far short of that commitment, but they have begun the process. Now, in terms of where does the United States stand with this? Well, we, to our credit, brought this to the international attention way back in 1988. This fellow is retired. He was the chief climate scientist for NASA for years and years and years. He retired to become a full-time professional activist and writer. So he has published several books about climate change. But for well over a quarter century, he was the chief climate scientist for NASA. And it was his testimony way back in the summer of 1988 that really jump-started attention to this. That same year in 1988, something you guys probably heard of, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. You know how governmental entities love their acronyms. So this is the IPCC. It also was formed in that same year, and we seem to be off to a running start. Of course, back then, most people referred to this as global warming. Certain television stations still does that, but most follow the lead of climate scientists and refer to it as a more complex term, which involves lots of different threats tied to the fact that temperatures are getting globally warmer. One of the things that the IPCC has done is it's basically a group that sponsors over 2,000 scientists around the world, leading climate scientists, including this fellow, Dr. Michael Mann, who, along with about a dozen, maybe a dozen and a half colleagues, came up with, well, 3 or 4 key colleagues came up with a famous graph that some of you have probably seen called the hockey stick graph. The work that he and the IPCC did over time, including highlighted by this famous graph, helped them share the Nobel Peace Prize in 2007 with former Vice President Al Gore. But tell me what you see with this graph. Darsh. All right, so you see the blade to Dr. Mann's hockey stick there is that spike over the last century, basically, right? Although, if you weren't a scientist and you looked at that x-axis and you saw what the measurement was, you might not be too alarmed, right? Because it doesn't look like it's that much. Even though visually it looks like much, you look at the measurement and it seems to be just about a degree.
And then I got clarity on it, that if you take a hockey stick and you lay it on the ground where it's flat, then all of a sudden the little part that hits the puck suddenly jumps up. Yeah. That's what they mean by the hockey stick graph. And
if those are, anybody seen An Inconvenient Truth, the original film with Al Gore? So he makes a big deal of this graph when he gets on a sort of a mechanized ladder and shows how significant this actually is, even though to a lay person it might not seem like much. But as Claes points out, the stick part, the 900 years that Darsh mentioned there, there's a lot of variation going on there, year to year, decade to decade, but over 900 years, you could make that into a line. And that's why the last 100 years is so important to note, that there's something going on there. All right, so a little bit more context. So we have 1988 when the U.S. is talking about this, and then we have this formation of the Ipcc. The next big major international setting is what is commonly referred to as the Earth Summit. The official title is the United Nations Conference on Environment and Development. And this is down in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil in 1992, so still way back. The reason that this is important in climate circles is because there are 6 major agreements that came out of that treaty. There's also some stuff that the U.S. did that wasn't too complimentary. But in any case, one of the major agreements that came out of this was something called the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. You see it listed here as one of those 6. And what that did is that set up for what we know today as this climate convention, the climate treaty. In particular, what it did is it pointed to another famous meeting 5 years later in Japan, in Kyoto. And that was the 3rd conference of parties on climate change. And it's the one that finally put some goals. They weren't actual, they weren't commitments that whoa, they weren't commitments that had meetings, including the meeting that Clay just got back from in Glasgow, have broken that record. But the other reason I wanted to call this to your attention is it established an idea that was, it's been a guiding force in how we think about climate change. But it's also helped expose what is a continuing tension in thinking about climate at the international level. And that is, everybody has a stake in this, but the different countries across the globe have different levels of responsibility. And that's what is meant by this phrasing. It's amazing when you read how these negotiations take place, or if you get to be there actually in person and see it. So sometimes they'll spend days going over 24 different adjectives to find which one is the right fit that they can all agree on. But in this case, that's what that's meant to indicate. And in fact, that's what happened a few years later at that first conference of parties. I know that speaking to the icebreaker, there's a lot of division in the United States still as to whether climate change is really a problem or not. But internationally, there's been agreement by basically the entire world, including the U.S. government at that time, that climate change is happening, and it's happening because of what we're doing. It's anthropogenic. Now, this was a big step in 1995 for politicians to say this, but it comes with a little bit of a caveat in that the adjective there, discernible, is one of those stories. They literally spent 48 hours and 30 adjectives on the list, and before they settled on that one. The biggest problems, I think, were countries like Saudi Arabia that were worried about future earning potential. Okay, so then we have the Kyoto Protocol, which the United States never actually, we signed, Vice President at the time, Al Gore, went and signed on, but we never actually ratified it. Of course, if the U.S. is going to be part of international law, the executive office is the one that negotiates that, but it's not actually force of law unless Congress, specifically one part of Congress, the Senate, agrees to. And the interesting story here politically is that several months before Gore actually went to Kyoto, the U.S. Senate was on record. This is in 1997. So maybe not quite as partisan as today or most recently, but it was pretty partisan in the 1990s too. They voted 95-0, pretty remarkable display of bipartisanship, not to consider any treaty that the Clinton administration would come back from Kyoto with at the end of the year, unless it included China and treated China the same as the United States. And kind of makes you wonder what the other 5 senators were doing. But the 95-0 is a really important message that was sent to the Clinton administration. And this is what that resolution was called. It's called the Byrd-Hagel resolution. And their thinking was they didn't want to make it difficult for the United States to compete economically with China. And that is, as you see from this pie chart, not exactly well thought out. It's more a political statement. And that is because the thinking was, or the argument was, that if the United States agrees to regulations that that require certain things of our industry, that industry will just simply pick up and go to China, where the regulations are not as strict, not as stringent. But as you see from this graph, what can really pick up and leave? I mean, theoretically, 22%, right? But that's like if they all go. But it's not like we're giving up our transportation or electricity or right? So in terms of the emissions that are being affected, we're talking about maybe at most just over a fifth. So a lot of folks would argue that that was more of a red herring than the red thread of China. And that kind of gets us to the next major point I wanted to make. So a big fight about climate change at the international level has been about whose fault is this? Increasingly, the problem does lie outside the United States. In fact, in late 2006, we lost our #1 status as the leading greenhouse gas emission country on an annual basis. Now, Mark Twain once said there's 3 types of lies: lies, damn lies, and statistics. There are a lot of different ways to look at this. So yes, annually, China is the most egregious party to greenhouse gas emissions for the last 15 years. But historically, they don't hold a candle to the United States. We're still #1 historically. And there's a lot of other Western states that are also major contributors. Additionally, if you think of it in a different way, if you think of it in terms of a per capita basis, the United States is well ahead of China. And so there are a number of different ways. Russia and former Soviet Union and today Russia, they like to think of this in terms of geography, so the breakdown, the emissions in terms of geography as the largest country in the world. The United States, when I was doing some talks years ago in Germany, they were getting nervous. This is back during the Bush administration. So they said, well, we'd really like you to include an energy intensity statistic. And so the United States looks good in terms of what's the ratio of economic production based on emissions. So we stack up pretty well there. But truth be told, the atmosphere doesn't give a, about that. All it cares about is the greenhouse gas emissions. So That said, these are some Sierra Club activists about 11 years ago down in Cancun, Mexico, during a different conference of parties. What else can help explain the lack of action? Well, I think that definitely there is this fight over who's responsible and who's going to help pay for what is needed next. But particularly focusing on us, as we like to do in the United States, what else can help explain the position that we have taken at the international level? And I think there's at least a half dozen different factors at work here. One of them is kind of going back to that hockey stick graph, and that is politically for a long time, we've now scaled this down a little bit at the advice of the climate scientists, but we were talking about 1.5 degrees Celsius, or we were talking about 2 for quite some time, 1.5 now, as the tipping point at which it becomes too late to take action. But again, as a non-scientist, you would think, well, that doesn't really sound like that much. And even if we inflate that, given being Americans to Fahrenheit standards, it still doesn't sound like that much, especially like an evening like tonight, right? So there's sort of a misunderstanding about what the numbers reflect, what the numbers actually mean. And that's why you have folks like Bill McKibben, who funded this organization, 350.org, argue that maybe a better way to tell this story is not about the temperature change, but a reflection of what's happening in the atmosphere. And what McKibben is doing is he's borrowing from climate scientists that argue, actually, if we want to have sort of the climate we've had for the last 10,000 years, where we've established our civilizations and our cities and our agriculture that we are familiar with today, we need to be at about 350 parts per million concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Anybody have a guess what we are today? What's that? That's a good guess. Yes, this is yesterday's measurement. This is a measurement that's been happening since 1957, 58, that winter. Every 4 hours on an observatory out in Hawaii. They chose this place so that it is, it's relatively remote in that it doesn't pick up localized pollution and can be a more accurate measure on true global averages. And what you see here, I know a couple of folks have seen this recently. What you see here is that measurement over the last, gosh, what is that now, 50, 60 years. And it's doing 3 things. The 3 things are represented here. 2 are fairly obvious, the third maybe not so much so. But what do you see with this graph? This is called the Keeling Curve, named after the original Keeling, and now his son has taken over these measurements. So one thing you see is the exponential growth, and that might be a little bit harder to see if we were stretch out our x-axis there a little bit more. You might be able to see that better, but it is exponential growth. So that means instead of just a straight line, it starts to become more curvilinear. It's growing also, of course, obviously, but then the piece that really strikes a lot of people that see this for the first time is the fact that it's got these jagged edges. It's going up and down every year. Anybody have a guess to this? Yes, sir. It is. It's because of the seasons. It shows how accurate this measurement is. So if you think of it, you look at a map. I think I saw a world map back there in the back. You look at a map where, if you divide it into the 2 hemispheres, you see most of the land masses in the northern hemisphere, in particular, most of the temperate land mass where vegetation changes depending on the season. So not so much here, but get further into northern Florida, you see that, right, where the trees lose their leaves in the wintertime. and we all learn what happens with trees and carbon dioxide. So literally what this graph is showing that breathing of the earth. And so each year it is continuing to do that, but each year the concentration of CO2 is going up. All right. So I think another factor at work here, it's not allowed on this platform anymore, is he? Another factor at work here, though, is this confusion. And I'm not going to say that's what was going on in his mind, but this confusion between what weather and climate are, right? And it helps explain why some people might suggest this, or they might point to a graph like this and say, well, no, just last year we had some record colds, so what's going on with global warming? Weather and climate are related, but they're not the same thing. You need 30 years of weather data to begin to talk about climate, right? So just because it's a cold day doesn't negate the fact that climate change is happening. This ties back to our seemingly, from a layperson's perspective, small number of 1.5 degrees. It's something that probably many of you have seen before, this idea of a cooked frog problem. Idea is, no, go try this at home, but the idea is if you throw a frog in a boiling pot of water, it says, oh crap, and it jumps right out. It realizes this is a problem. But if you slowly ratchet up the temperature over time, the frog doesn't realize it's in trouble. And of course, and in this analogy, we're the frog and the pot's the planet. And I think that that is definitely a factor in the position that the U.S. has taken, because the U.S. public does remain split on how big a problem this is. Okay, I love using this cartoon, not just because it was in one of, when it was in my first book, but because it was in, the fellow that drew this drew it in 1995, 10 years before Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. And it underscores for me, and I hope for you, this argument that taking action on climate change isn't worth it financially, right? That why would we do that? That costs money. Let's worry about things that are a problem right now. Well, not taking action on climate change costs money too. In fact, a few years back, well, you can see a chart here of different decades, what we've been spending on weather and climate-related disasters. But in 2017, we spent $306 billion. Taking action has a price, not taking action has a price. That economic issue is a big one, but it might not be as big as this, and that is the ideological opposition to climate change. What is that? Well, it basically, in a lot of ways, it's similar to what we've seen the last almost 2 years now with the coronavirus and the worldwide pandemic. This tension between private rights and public rights. And what the fear is on the right is that climate regulation is a Trojan horse for all sorts of other liberal agendas to come flowing out, and more regulation taking away individual rights. That's one way to think about it. Another way to think about it is the environmentalists are just they're just watermelons, right? They might be green on the outside, but they're communist red on the inside. Yeah, that is true. We still have, it's amazing that we still have that discussion in 2021. And then it's still another way to think about this is sort of like a Pandora's box kind of a problem. This is just the sort of same thing as the Trojan horse, that this is just the first of many regulations to be hit with. So that ideological stance, it shows up. It shows up in all kinds of ways, right? And this goes back to Michael Mann. This is an email that he actually received. I'll pause for a minute as you look through it. So I'm really proud that he endorsed my last book. His blurb is on the back of it. But I mean, this is not somebody that has, you know, a financial stake in one of the, you know, major fossil fuel companies. This is, you know, this is not somebody that, I mean, obviously there might be a few screws loose here, but this gets to that ideological issue, and it shows that it's more than just the economic piece. And then finally, as I kind of near the end here and save some time for questions, there is the fact that we're dealing with a lot of different countries with a lot of different priorities. And in the UN, that now means 193 states. That's a lot, right? That's a little bit harder than the college folks, or remember back to times when you were in college when you had 5 friends and you were trying to order pizza and decide what kind of pizza it would be, because these 193 states aren't necessarily friends, and they're not talking about pizza, right? They're talking about the very foundation of how our world works, the energies that we use, how our economy runs. And so the stakes are very high. And within that, there's this idea that the atmosphere has for decades been a free dumping ground. It's what we call in the social sciences a tragedy of the commons. It's an idea that was written about in the 1960s, borrowed from a political philosopher in the United Kingdom back in the 1830s. This idea that when you have a public resource that everyone has access to, people overuse it. And there's no incentive to restrict how you use it because your neighbor is just going to keep overusing it. And in this case, that's, you know, that applies to sort of international fisheries, that applies to outer space issues. Remember the recent concern about Russia blowing up a satellite and the impact that the debris was going to have on other states. So those kinds of things, it applies to resources like that, but it also applies to sinks like the atmosphere. And right now we've continued this basically since Britain being the first country to industrialize in the 1750s, in 1780s, that period, we've been using that as a free dumping ground. And there's no incentive to restrict it if others are going to continue to do that. This was a meeting that happened right before the Paris Accords back in 2015. And I think it sets the stage. I've talked a lot about what hasn't happened and the problems at the international level, but it sets the stage for where there is hope. And that is in terms of the 2 leading greenhouse gas emission countries, China and the United States. There's hope if these folks, we don't have to be friends. We can use that competition in a way, you know, competition, just like in athletics, competition politically can bring out the best, can also bring out the worst, but it can bring out the best in folks. And there's real hope that that will happen, that these 2 states, United States and China, will set a pattern that the rest of the world will have no choice but to follow. But I wanted to end here with the former governor of California to underscore that despite some inactions many inactions at the national level in the United States. There's been plenty that's been happening in what a former Supreme Court Justice Brandeis, called the laboratories of democracy. So plenty have been happening at the state level. And in particular, Governor Schwarzenegger can be known as the carbon terminator for what he did way back in 2006 now, in terms of helping, and he did this with bipartisan support, as a Republican governor working with the Democratic legislature, to really position California as a leading entity in greenhouse gas emission policies and reducing their emissions. But even more to the local level, what's been happening at the municipal level of governance, and the role that we have seen mayors across the country play, including here, right here in Orlando. And there's a map of the different cities that have been making noted regulatory adjustments to reduce their carbon footprint. And where I would end this sketch of climate policy is to focus on this local level, and the fact that clearly, as public opinion has improved in its understanding of climate change, there's still something missing. Going back to Kristen's statistic that she gave us, yes, we're a little over 50% in understanding that climate change is a problem, but we're still under 50% in the United States in terms of public opinion and understanding that it's a problem for us specifically. Now, that varies a lot depending on where you live in the United States. So those in South Florida are going to be higher. If you're in Flash Flood Alley in Texas and Austin area, that's going to be higher. If you're out in California where the wildfires are happening, that's going to be higher. Parts of Alaska certainly are going to be higher. But overall, still less than half Americans fear climate change is a threat to them. And so what I would argue, and what I'm arguing in a current project, is that the only way that changes is through action at the local level. Kind of like people, just listening this morning on the way to work on the radio, people in hospitals in Michigan on ventilators still saying that COVID's not a real thing. And they're not listening to the scientists until they actually get exposed to the virus. And so they're having their coming of age moment, their understanding, when they actually get there into the hospital. So as they're going into it, still not a problem, but they finally realize it in some cases when it's too late. But that would be the argument with climate change is the most impressive action. Yes, there's still a role at the international level, but where we're really going to move the needle is scaling up from the bottom first. All right, I'll stop there and see if anyone has any questions. Yes.
Empty already out. China is running more coal than ever. That they cut off Australia. They got better Australia. So there's to import coal from Australia. So now they don't have coal from Australia. They have to mine more in China. Is what they're doing. Huge environmental impacts. Number two is the Build Back Better bill, which you didn't talk about. That will impact so much if we can get that passed. And number three, to take action locally. My climate czars, Jeff over here, and Caroline comes out to my press events too. We're going to be at Marco Rubio's office next Thursday at 11 o'clock. Would love to have you guys come. Truly, there's a hope in hell that he's going to vote for Build Back Better, but it makes me feel better to just go give my voice and just hold up a sign that says, take action. I mean, how can you just say, but you're a liberal bias because, you're a professor according to the Republican Party, and you're probably liberal because you read the New York Times too, I bet. So we can't change certain viewpoints, but it just makes us feel better to go speak up sometimes.
One thing that I didn't hit on the ideology standpoint is this idea about who best fits the portrait of an environmentalist. So yeah, the last 2 decades, 3 decades, it's definitely, maybe even going back to the 1970s, been thought of as a liberal issue. But if you think about the word conservative, I mean, that's, you want to keep things the way they are, protect the status quo, avoid radical change. Who really should be interested in climate change? It should be conservative. And you look back at the US history of environmental issues, there are plenty of examples of conservatives that were interested in the environment. It's really only since the sort of the 1980s that it's become polarized when you talk about environmental issues in the United States. There's lots of examples, whether you talk about the big burst of legislation in the early 1970s during the Nixon administration, or you go back to the birth of the national park system. That didn't start until 1916, but the ideas really came out during another Republican's administration, Theodore Roosevelt. So there's lots of reasons that this could be a bipartisan issue, and maybe one name for you to look into is a former representative out of South Carolina, Representative Bob Inglis, and he's got a group after he got voted out of office, got primaried, that focuses expressly on climate change. And I had a really nice conversation with him a couple years ago during the midterm elections in 2018, where he said, you know, conservatives really need to get behind this issue, or we're going to miss this boat again, like we have other issues in the 20th century, and that there are real reasons as a conservative to be worried about climate change and not ignore it, but take part in the policy debate about what do we do about it. Yes. Thank you.
You talked about a lot of different policies and acts and all of that different stuff. And I was wondering if you could think of any legislation or acts that really did the most to fight climate change and what made it different, just to kind of help us know what to look out for and what we're looking for in these climate solutions.
Okay. Well, another thing that Mary mentioned was the Build Back Better Act, and I think it's this idea that environmental issues have been often labeled as special interest, and that it's pitting one interest against another. And I think that is, first off, that's not fair, but second off, that creates sort of a zero-sum game mentality. And what this legislation of the Build Back Better infrastructure points out is that they're all tied together. Like the different interests are, it's not special interest, there's collective interest at stake. And so I think legislation that looks at health issues, justice issues, infrastructure issues, as well as the climate issues, that's where the sort of the sweet spot where you can see some very unusual allies come together, like in the environmental movement when hunters would come together with what would be considered more liberal groups to protect an ecosystem, an area. So that's where I think there's a lot of potential. Maybe more specifically to your question, one example I like to give of it's not as complex as climate change, but I think it's a good example still of where we had legislation that made a difference, and then we kind of scaled up and we pushed that on the international arena, was with the old chlorofluorocarbons, the CFCs that used to be inside hairspray and deodorant and styrofoam, and probably most significantly in air conditioning coolants. The Freon was the trade name. We had that for basically from the 1930s to the 1970s, and then in 1977 the United States banned their production and required alternatives be developed. And companies like DuPont Chemical were dragged along kicking and screaming. They didn't want this, they didn't want this, they didn't want this. Then over the next 10 years, they realized they could do it when they were forced to, and they developed these alternatives, and they said, hey, you know, why should we be satisfied with the US market? Let's say that this needs to be an international law, and we can fill all kinds of other markets as well. And so during the Reagan administration in 1987, the United States, backed by some significant financial interests like DuPont Chemical, pushed and were successful in getting something called the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. And that's widely considered as the most effective international environmental agreement on the books today. One thing it did, by the way, is it recognized those common but differentiated responsibilities. So it said to the developing world that you didn't have to go on the same timetable that the developed world has to go to. But that treaty, I think, is an example of where you get significant financial interests supporting instead of opposing. Then you can make real headroads.
To segue off Kristen's question, and you just sort of did it with the Montreal Protocol. Along the same veins, there's been some discussion in Build Back Better about a carbon fee. I think that goes back to what you said, one of the basic reasons for the problems, the tragedy of the commons and market failures. Can you talk a little bit about that as a significant policy that would affect climate?
Great question.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. I like maybe a little bit of a switch on it in that the carbon dividend, right? So there is the fee assessed, but then that goes back to the American people. It's a twist on what Alaska does. If you're familiar with Alaska and the relationship they have with their oil companies, so if you live in Alaska throughout a calendar year, you get a check sometime between October and Christmas, I think, right? And it varies depending on how the oil companies did that year, but it can be anywhere from $700-800 to up to $2,000, $2,200 at times it's been, and that's there's some problems with that. Alaska, in a lot of ways, Alaska is more like a developing country than it is like another fellow U.S. state, because they are so dependent on their extractive industry, especially oil. If you look at where their education dollars come from, where their government services dollars come from, it's overwhelmingly from the oil industry. And then there's the fact that the public supports it because they get that nice bonus in time for Christmas. Well, a twist on that would be this carbon dividend. So there is that fee that gets assessed, but then the money goes back into the pocketbooks of the voters. And then you would make you would have different specifics in there that would incentivize how that funding could get spent. And there's several groups out there that are advocating and lobbying for this, and I'm hoping a couple of the folks in this room will try and do that for instance, with Rollins. And there's a higher ed initiative, for example. Stetson's been very involved in some of these efforts, and I'd like to see Rollins follow suit. Sure. Yes.
So you being the professor, I'm mostly interested in terms of curriculum. I'm Casey Pietro, and I represent Ideas in terms of the UCF branch. So I want to talk a little bit more about how you feel about the intersections of teaching about climate change in maybe curriculums or majors that aren't solely biology based. For example, if a student wants to be an engineer, specifically industrial engineer, or our vice president at Ideas UCF, she is a business economics major. She was taking an environmental economics course, where she said the professor never mentioned climate change sustainability, and she had to physically go to the textbook and maybe was able to find 2 paragraphs contributed to.
That's still a problem. I think we're doing a much better job than we did just 10, 20 years ago on that. But it is a continuing problem. And, you know, part of it is that faculty are trained within a discipline, and those can become siloed, if you will, and they become very insular, and they don't even use the same words, right? The same rhetoric, the same language. And so it's difficult for them to communicate with one another. They publish in different types of journals, not always trained to speak to a general public, right? So they're not necessarily communicators, ironically enough. But I think we're doing a better job of that, and we continue to try and improve. And part of that is because of the work of different environmental groups. Oftentimes they start at the primary level in elementary schools. And it's not easy, but there are all sorts of interesting connections from these different disciplines. And increasingly we are seeing folks like Michael Mann, that are kind of in the tradition of Rachel Carson and Carl Sagan, that they really know their stuff. Their credentials within their discipline are stellar, but they're also good communicators, and they're able to write and speak to wider audience. And they're building these bridges for us across these disciplines. But you're exactly right. We need to do better. Sure. Clay.
Yeah, many things. Great presentation, of course, as always. Thank you. That's wild about getting paid to live in Alaska. I once upon a time knew that, but then somehow forgot. It's just fascinating. They've got a lot of issues going on there. I actually think it's the state with the highest murder rate in the United States as well.
It might be. They have depression issues, certainly.
Yeah, well, it's just completely lawless because there's no police. So, but anyway. Interesting things, breaking up some of the history with Montreal Protocol and Rio, the original Earth Summit,
right.
That would become Rio plus 20. So what Ideas for Us was formed at the University of Central Florida. A professor named Penelope Canam, who was one of the 4 authors on the Montreal Protocol, was a teacher for Chris Castro. And as his project in her class, he created the Club Ideas. So we have this really interesting direct line to that group that worked on the Montreal Protocol, which is pretty cool. She also came up with the study of environmental sociology, which I think is so important in understanding what moves people in the environment and how they make decisions and all of that kind of stuff. It was great to see some real Earth Summit slides, because right after Ideas became part of the UN, the very first conference we ever attended was Rio plus 20. And as you know, I was just at COP26. These conferences that have numbers associated with them, plus 20 or 26, is always kind of dismal for me, because I realize people have been talking about the exact same thing with little to no action for 20 years in one case, and then in COP26 now 26 years. So that is, of course, discouraging, but I'm hoping that we get farther from that. I wanted to just share that today I received word that a bill that I wrote, that Ideas for Us is pushing through, has been carried by 2 representatives and a senator. It's House Bill 4103. We're launching a campaign about this. This is my 3rd bill I've authored now, 3rd attempt. But it would bring funding for workforce creation programs here to Central Florida, also Tampa Bay region and Miami region. Reasoning because, and we're so fortunate we have bipartisan support on this particular bill, Democratic senator and Republican representatives. And the reason I think is because I pitched to them this concept around economics and job creation. So I think it's really important to meet people at what their concerns are when you're talking about climate-related things. How have you experienced that as a professor working between the students and, say, administration of colleges and making this case for climate advancement?
Yeah, so I think the Climate Leadership Corps, I think is the name of Al Gore's group now. I remember sitting in on one of their training sessions, and like the biggest take home that I got from there, and one I think will resonate with you folks, is you try to find where the common interests are, right? So you can't go in and say, you're wrong, or don't you understand the facts, or you can't come in with that approach.
As fun as that would be.
As fun as that would be, right? So even Senator Rubio should have some common interest in this, and it, you know, it might be difficult for some people to acknowledge that publicly, but I think that's where you start and you build from that. And one of the ways that people have had most success with is with the idea of the future and children, and you know, what do you want a legacy to be? What do you want? Do you want to hand the bill to your children and their children, or do you want to make sure that they have a chance at what you have? And that's where I think the best avenues are. Now, speaking more directly to like how would you interact on a college campus or a corporation?
What are some things that you think students right now in 2022
Right.
do to push Rollins more in that direction?
Right. Well, one thing that a couple of our alumni, you know, I think creating pockets in Central Florida that are more inviting to not use cars, making things more walkable. And one thing that class just had this morning, we had some presentations from the students. They're talking about intersections where you have to wait for minute after minute. One presentation, they actually showed sort of an odd intersection, if you're familiar with the area where Orange Avenue, Fairbanks, Aloma, and I'm not sure what that other road is, but the sort of three roads kind of converge. And they said it took them 30 minutes to cross over each of those in a way that followed the traffic light. So obviously that's not an intersection that's designed for someone to walk across. It's an intersection with what I would argue a 20th century mentality, is that the roads are for cars to get them out of here. And you know, going back to finding some common interest, I think most of those businesses, they operate with a 20th, that are in that area, operate with a 20th century mentality that I need parking, I need access for the cars to get here. But if you look at the research, the cars are simply leaving. The people that spend the money, and there's been studies done all across the US and outside the US too, are the people that aren't driving. The car that comes by and does spend money might spend more money on that one trip, but over the course of the month, the person that's not in the car spends more money. And so even if it would just be, for example, in the Rollins Winter Park world, to make Fairbanks, at least give the pedestrian equal footing, right? Don't make the pedestrian wait 5 minutes to cross one road as cars zoom by. Sometimes they're at 40, 45 miles an hour. Make those cars drop down to 20. If you do that, by the way, and you get hit by a car, you have like 95% chance of survivability. That flip-flops once you get up to 40 miles an hour. You have 95% chance of not surviving. So,
well, that's a great point, because now is an actually good time to have students show up at town hall meetings in Winter Park. I remember when I was a student, I had a Winter Park address, right? So I'd show up, at these town hall meetings. I'd usually be the only person there under, you know, I don't know, 70 that would show up there. And, you know, right now, Winter Park is kind of grappling with what to do with the Progress Point site. One of the arguments is park space, green space, complete streets. I'm a founding board member of the Winter Park Land Trust, and we're having our voice amplified for that. Having Rollins students show up to those meetings in 2022 would be a big deal. Just saying.
Sure, I think that's all the time we have for questions. Thank you so much. Wow, I'm pumped. I'm ready to go out and get my voice heard. I don't know about you guys. So now is the time to do that. Let's talk at our tables. We're gonna have a breakout session. How can we make climate change personal to our community? That's one of the things we talked about, and how do we turn that into action? So thinking about everything that we talked about today, let's create some action items, not only for us as an organization, but for us as individuals. So I'm gonna give you guys around 10 minutes to talk about it, and then we're gonna come up and share. So speed thinking, because we had some great questions today, but. All right, you guys can go ahead and start on that. Thank you. Don't worry. You want to start right now?
Honestly, I think the biggest thing that gets in the way of these conversations is that this side or this side.
Yeah.
There's no middle ground. I mean, one thing that we were, it's on my mind because I'm out working on it right now. One of the things that we talked about with our position,
Go hand yourself in the door to
we're green, but we're really the people that are going to help us get to where we are. So there are things that we're going to do that you guys think that are very nice and say, you know what, that's bad, you shouldn't do it. But at the same time, if it brings on countries that won't do it otherwise, then it's, for me, it's okay. Because I'm just getting there, you know. And I think what happens a lot of times, we come to these conversations and it's either Ruby's position or it's, you know, the opposite. You know, there's no middle ground, and so people go, oh, well, I don't want to change, so I'll break it down. You know, and so.
What's going to break that long chain is a project like yours, where we all support it, it's not a Republican or Democrat, everyone needs public transportation.
True.
So I think you're going to have to find a project, we're going to have to break this bipartisan chain. What can we focus on, whether it's right for Sunrail, whether you're on the Green Line.
There are certain like me out there that are moderate. I think it's just finding solutions that are do work. I mean,
Exactly.
I'll be honest with you, there's gonna be pipelines in our guideways that are gonna carry jet fuel. There are green fuels around, sure. But guess what? There are no pipelines between Orlando and Canaveral right now. And so all that jet fuel is coming by diesel truck. It's a step forward. It's not perfect, but it's better, you know. But that's the kind of pieces you, like, we appeal to people like Gunter because we make a profit. You know, we appeal to people on my side of the world because we're trying to greenify things that aren't green now. You know, so, and I'm not saying this to like toot our own horn or anything like that, because we are the best kept secret in Central Florida because we have no funding until this week. So, I still don't have it yet.
I love that idea.
So, but I mean, that's my thing. I mean, I've met, well, you said this, I will not meet with person, even though I know I'll have to do it. So I made an alliance with someone who manages the bus, so I can deal with them. So I can fix the problem for them, and then they will come on board with us, and I don't have to deal with it.
Really lines with what you were saying too, when you were like, we have to think everybody has to win, everybody has to benefit, and that's where I think that the problem is missing. It has to be equal.
I like what you said too, you said it's something that's benefiting us all, right? What's benefiting us all, other than like transportation. If it can be green transportation, cars off the road, now it's like a win-win. Except for maybe conservation. Yeah.
It's a diesel electric train, and they got environmental support from the Department of Environmental Protection because they're taking their cars off the road. And I'm like, but you're putting them in something dirty. And I know one of the directors over there, and he's like, yeah, but I put them in cars, and that's what we use to measure.
Their leaflet at the event was like all their environmental benefits.
Well, good for you. I have good news for you. We're gonna finish. I mean, there's no sort of bottle works, and I can, we shouldn't take this time to do it, but I can explain to you what That's what they're saying.
Well, I mean, transportation is usually a good thing no matter what. It's also
What were
a
some of
scary
the,
thing. A lot
I
of
don't want to say I'm topic here, but what were some of the retorts that you had?
Yeah,
You
that's a
have to
big.
have something that's accessible. I mean, the people that need transportation are the people that can't afford to go on the Bright Line. Bright Line's gonna charge $40 minimum. So when we were gonna bid against them for the Tampa run, in our shtick, we were gonna put in folks, how'd you like to go for the Tampa run? Because you'll lose money on passengers no matter what. So I can charge like $50, I can charge you $4, I still lose money. So why not make it cheap and get more
Trains
people
are
on board?
non-economically, like, sustainable thing unless it's subsidized by the government.
Yeah, still, they're not making money, they're just gonna get by.
So many of these
I was
things are
doing some lobbying.
and in modern
And the
American
guy,
society, there's such a melting pot.
it's very expensive. Why would I ever take a train like that? I can just
Modern
have my car now.
technology,
He just like had no interest in public transportation, couldn't be.
sometimes we're,
He just told me, well, of
What
course.
about that last hour and a half outside of the
because of that, I think some of these.
Yeah.
I mean, when you have to train after not being caught in that traffic.
Well, I think part of the challenge for them is that they're from Miami. For now, most people that live south of West Palm think that it's the gospel.
And
So hopefully some of the
This kind of goes back to my belief in like direct experience. So one of the things, one of the stories I've heard that Orlando, Mayor Dyer, and Chris Castro, they decided that they wanted to better market Orlando and Central Florida. In particular, after there was a front-page New York Times article about Orlando leading the country in pedestrian deaths. Yeah, people get run over. So, actually, Central Florida has like 3 of the top 5.
Oh my God.
So Tampa's bad also, but we're number 1. And so they were like, how do we better PR our region? And one of the things they came up with, well, let's go look at a place that has a really good reputation. So they went to Portland, Oregon. And then there they experienced the public transit and the fact that you can get out of the airport on rail, like a buck, probably a little bit more now, but when I did it 2 years ago, it was like a $1.50, $1.75. And you actually pass on the interstate, the other cars on the interstate, on the rail, and you get into the downtown area, and then once you're downtown, $300 for free on the rail system. And so stuff they've done over the last 50 years in Portland, and these folks experienced it, and they're like, okay, we're going to try and do things that follow that example. But I think it's that you have to see it yourself to really be a believer.
See the future of that, yes.
Well, I think more people do want to do green things, they just are afraid of the change. I mean, that group of 20% that you got on the statistic that believe that it's real but don't think it will affect them, it's not that they don't, I don't think they think it will affect them, I think it's that they're afraid of the changes that come if they admit it.
Well, that's also where it's
Because if they've got kids,
like, how do we make people know that it's gonna literally affect them? It's like, I don't think that fear really drives people. I think it's just, you know, a want for greater good, but at the end of the day, like, we kind of need people to be a little scared. So that's part of the question, is how do we display that urgency to the community? Because I'm, like, all of this is, like, really important conversation, but as far as, like, things that we can actually do and, like, get started on, like, tomorrow, I think that it's just messaging and the pushing and getting people out to vote for certain things and to support certain voices. So that's kind of where I want to steer the conversation to, too, is, like, how do we make that work?
I put some of this into action. So the first one is a bipartisan narrative. The second is community-wide projects such as green transportation for all, benefiting all, such as going green. Education such as flooding, storm surge, like you can literally see that in communities. And some people just haven't seen it. So people who don't live the coast. Historical data in an easy to understand format, which we provided tonight. It's obvious, you know. Municipally funded eco action projects, so like having cities and counties and, federally funded projects to push the community to understand and adopt that, yes, this is happening and we want to give money towards it. And it's making it more legit, right? And we see that the city of Orlando is trying to have a sustainability presence in the United States. And then also what you said about the precedents of green cities, having people see what it's like to live and showcasing a positive change in lifestyle. So if you just want to spend less money and, have more of a social travel, and you can read a book, and play games, and you don't have to be in your car, upset, and screaming. And then something that I contributed is a lifelong education to all generations. I used to teach at a homeschool, and I'm still I think that education is the key for children to grow up with a sense of responsibility for the planet, a sense of understanding of the ecosystems that they're in, how precious they are, and having more of that in whatever facet they can. And I'll also add that school gardens are a great way, but school gardens of all types, so native, edible, and then even aquatic, to give those examples. It's something precious worth saving for.
One thing I would put out there, and this is not something you can do tomorrow, but it's something for months, which is travel to places that are going to be affected by it. And I'm not saying go to ecotourism, because honestly, you're actually, for the most part, bad for those areas. But experiencing some of these places, I've been to Africa, I've been to the Middle East, and I gotta tell you, I was very much a Republican until I went to the Middle East while we were more there. And had conversations with people that were people that were probably very, very realistic, but just hearing their comments about what they experienced, what they're experiencing because we're poor and near their country.
Well, when I went to Europe, I realized that, having blown out the Fleet Army program, I realized that having a garden at home is not a new idea. It's something that, I tried to explain it to some people, so what? Having an at-home garden is something that is part of their lifestyle. Having transit that can be to different countries in, short amounts of time. Unless you see these examples, it's kind of hard for people to get outside of their box. With data as well, people have done their own research or have, this is so powerful.
One of the things about
And there are
blockchain
there's
technology,
strong
with advancing
campaigns against
currencies
the
around
entire
the world,
idea of
especially
climate
in philanthropy,
change and against
some kind of
solar panels, against all these other things that we know is the lesser of the evils, right? So I think a big question too is how do we educate or showcase by direct action fight this
to the Democratic Republic of the
fake
Congo
news, if you want to call it.
ruling
It
party.
can go somewhere
It
you
would be
can destroy
transparent, so
they're
already
gonna
know
be
there's
affected. We have that power. We're
to
working
be
in
put in place because there's a
at-risk
tremendous
communities
amount of
in sub-Saharan
nepotism.
Africa where
So we've got
children
volunteering, my
it's
contribution to
happening
this is
right
town
now.
hall
They had
meeting, showing, making signs,
entire
speaking,
schools flooded
anyone can
because
do
their
that who lives in
farmers
one
were
park,
using
including on
practices
campus, so
and
anywhere 32789.
direct action with them
And
and
public comments, of course,
just
and
telling those
stuff that they're
people that are going to be affected
or
by
any of these other
these
kinds of
actions
things like
and
that.
include the
Put
data.
that spectrum of
We keep
environmental
posting
communications.
graphs.
I think
People are
there's
like,
some
oh,
definite things that can be
I'm
done
over
here
it.
to
But if you
do
tell
with
the story and
marketing.
include data, I think those both are really, really
And
powerful.
of course, art.
Yeah, I don't
Art
want to
transcends
graphs.
everything, so
I go
you
there
can
to
reach
turn my
people.
brain on.
Well, the memes are great because you're learning, but you're laughing, and you want to be part of the joke. What do you think, Julie?
No, I was just mostly thinking about the public transportation, how that's your thing. We did a post for Orlando, I guess for Orlando, and it was just how bad it is.
The table, really.
It's like what we need to focus on.
Yeah, that's a shared.
Well, any of you guys been to Thanksgiving? Could you talk about the weather?
As we know, because people just want better food, right? Cheaper, better, healthier, local foods, for at least in my world. So having that as something that says, well, if you're having your food locally, you're cutting out the transportation costs, cutting out the slave labor and the other things that make food so cheap, even with transportation and walks and distribution and all that. So.
If I said to you there's flooding because of a hurricane or because of global warming, I could say there's Goldsboro, which is in I live in College Park, and every time we have a heavy rain, my street floods in College Park too, so make it local.
Well, it's not in my backyard.
Yeah.
Mine said,
Well, and support for innovation. I mean, we can build better, more stars. I mean, yeah, you go on the lakes, but
All these things.
and publicly congratulating and celebrating innovations. Like, what business wouldn't want to be known for being an innovator or, getting themselves ahead in some way? So, like, again, municipally funded, like, I'll also write awards and recognition.
like University of Iowa, it's home based in the College of Physics. It has college degrees in the College of Engineering and the College of Medicine. And that's really powerful. And because a lot of those engineers, they never thought that they could have businesses where they never, where they had these great ideas. We had these come out of there. The guy that, if you've ever seen the car seat you can pull out of your car and put it in a stroller, that was invented by a guy that I went to school with. And he did it in class. I mean, so if you can get engineers into this place where they can see where they can do things other than just go work for someone.
Rollins also had something, a green sustainability talks.
Yeah,
that
it was about equity and racial discrimination.
Yes, yeah, I think those are so powerful for other, professors and students in the community to get inspired about having these conversations. And, I think that brings about change. Having speakers that inspire that.
Yeah, we should pick somebody to present All right, you guys can go ahead and finish up your conversations. All right, who would like to start presenting your ideas? Any volunteers? All right, Caroline, come on up here.
I'm in school and it makes me happy.
These are the solutions that we use to make our eco action and more, so take it away.
Thank you.
Want me to hold this?
Yeah, yes, please. So our group had a really great discussion, a lot about green transportation. I'll start with that. Having something that is bipartisan, something that everybody would be benefited off of, really can make people realize that we're one community, right? And these ideologies that separate us really, in a way, don't exist. But one thing that we talked about was, green transportation to be something that would join us together. Also, education, examples of flooding, storm surge, historical data that's easy to understand, perhaps in a meme format even that makes people, have a good little laugh about it. It helps people to see that. Take in new information. Casey was talking about how a certain place in South Florida, she could see that it has flooding that just comes closer and closer to the road. So she experienced that, but not everybody who lives in coastal communities in Florida might have that reality. Also, municipalities really have the opportunity to create a sense of legitimacy in the climate change fight, and having municipally funded eco-action projects, perhaps through Ideas for Us, just saying, or having some sort of award and recognition for businesses that are innovating in any of these different environmental or sustainability ways really makes that more prevalent, whether it's your city or county, et cetera. Precedents of green cities, so showcasing a positive change in lifestyle, having people see that there's another way of life, right? And for instance, in Portland, Oregon, how they have a better transportation system that's more affordable and greener at the same time. So it's a benefit, no matter what you believe. Politically, also having experiences of maybe traveling to Europe and seeing transportation there, to see people having gardens there, part of their their family lifestyle. When we're exposed to new things, and travel is such a good example of that, we see that there's another world possible. And so having more videos, personal stories of that circulating is a great way to showcase that. Lifelong education to all generations, really starting from little babies to adults and seniors, to have opportunity for people to see that this is something that they're aware of and that they can do something about, and it makes the world a better place. In terms of school gardens being places where people can learn not only edible experiences, but also through native landscaping and aquatic habitats, what we could do together to be more eco-friendly. The local food movement, like green transportation, is something that kind of brings us all together, and having more opportunities for people to be engaged in local food has a huge environmental benefit of not having any transportation and distribution cost to our environment through all the ways that we currently move food around. And then we just mentioned some other things like what is this? Oh, maybe summits in academia, climate summits, to have more professors and students from other areas have a healthy dialogue around climate change as it changes in topics. Support for innovation, really speaking to local places and supporting equity.
Amazing. Thank you so much, Caroline. Those are some we'll just put that there. Those are some direct things that we can do, especially starting with the storytelling and the educating. Like we were saying, we have a lot of members and volunteers in at-risk places that we want to share their stories to make it personal. So do I have a volunteer from this table that wants to come and share your ideas? Or I'll just interpret the board myself. No, I'm just kidding. All right, come on up, Melissa. Woo! Would you like me to hold your board? There you go.
Okay. So we kind of broke it down to 4 sections. The first one is volunteering. So it's all about getting the younger generations to come and get educated and figure out how we can preserve and conserve for the future generations, because that is a really big part about conservation. Bipartisanship. We were talking about I'm sorry, what was your name, sir? James. He teaches at a high school in Seminole County, and we were talking about how he's not afraid to talk to his students about his political beliefs, and he wants it to be a very open classroom where everyone can kind of share how they feel, no matter there will be no discrimination, nothing like that, no matter where you're coming from. And I go to Stetson, and I feel like that is a huge part of a problem that we are experiencing as kind of a younger generation. We're afraid to start fights. We're afraid to get into arguments. Even though Stetson is a very liberal school, the population itself is very divided. Half of the school comes from South Florida, Central Florida. Other half of the school comes from Volusia County, so it's kind of blue versus red. And there's a big divide between the students, so we don't really collaborate that much. I feel like the bluer students kind of commute and they go off campus and they come here, and then the red students kind of stay there. So we were talking about how we need to like, you know, bridge that gap and really talk to each other without being afraid of there being fights or discourse or anything like that. Because after all, that's a healthy conversation, you know, that's what leads to understanding. Education and outreach, basically what I was just talking about, you know, in the education sector, we need to do a better job of incorporating like environmental communication into every branch of colleges, whether you're a STEM major, you're in the College of Arts and Sciences, even the music school, like everything incorporates the environment. It doesn't matter what your major is, so it all needs to be talked about in a social element. You know, environmental justice, very important. So that hackathons, just again, like getting students more engaged. We talked about how that does happen a lot, so we're just gonna keep like progressing on that. Town hall meetings, you know, people showing up, speaking, public comments, that does make a big difference. Like we talked about, I mean, local legislators, what affects us directly the most, so we need to get students out there and talking and sharing their thoughts without being scared of being shot down or thought of lowly because they're younger. Like my age group, I feel like we need to be doing what we can so that we have a good life when we're like 50 years old. But so spectrum of environmental ideologies. I'm actually conducting senior research right now on sustainability and where people fall on the spectrum. The spectrum is basically just like the farthest left being the most like man-centered, so like everything on Earth is made for man. There's no such thing as overconsumption, whereas farthest to the right is the most ecocentric. So that being nature is extremely valuable. We are equal, if not, it is more important. We need to preserve it. So I'm doing research on how people, you know, conceptualize sustainability and where that correlates and they fall into the spectrum, because that's just like one step closer to understanding, you know, how can we reverse or at least stifle climate change? How can we stop the climate crisis? It goes down to understanding the individualistic, you know, perspective. So things like that are very important. Marketing, art, music, social media, that's all ways that we can spread the word, because after all, it is 2021. TikTok is like the most effective way of getting a point across. You know, it's the biggest audiences that see it, so especially, again, my age group, we're all on top of that. So if we want to get a point across, we want to get it quickly to thousands or maybe millions of people, get it on TikTok. But yeah, that's what we came up with.
Awesome, thank you so much. Fantastic. I think we did just make a TikTok as an organization. Give us a follow. Hey. I would absolutely love for you to answer. Come on up here. Real local solutions right here. It's the most sustainable church I've ever seen. Melissa. Eco-organizer.
I was going to say, can we convene in sort of Hi all, I apologize that I'm coming in late. I'm Pastor Sarah Robinson. I'm the pastor here at the church. I just want to welcome you here. Thank you for coming. I think about this question all the time because this is a huge passion of mine. And so a few things I've learned along the way that I just wanted to share as well is, first, I continually redefine the word community as including all of the environment, the microbes in the soil, the birds, everything, the rocks, and I try to continually redefine that word for people in the neighborhood, for the people here in my church. And when we redefine that word and we started thinking more inclusively about that word, it brings those things to the table when we're making decisions. And so that's one big shift that hopefully helps people getting around kind of the political touch words and things like that. The other thing I found really effective is talking about and working around the idea of disaster resilience for communities on very local levels to broad levels, working around the concept of disaster resilience. Once again, I actually think that circumvents a lot of the words that freak people out, and solutions can really be tailored by communities themselves. if they're thinking of the word community as inclusive, all inclusive. And then they are addressing the situations on a very, very local level. So I've seen that really work. And that was from disaster resilience folks that came into Orlando after the 2017 hurricane, Irma, and worked through disaster resilience with some of the worst hit communities and neighborhoods here. And listening to them, I was really influenced by those ideas because it's really the same thing. So anyway, yeah.
Much. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Sarah. Well, these are the ideas that we take to turn into eco-action projects and also use internally to create our programming and to stimulate certain education programs that we do. So thank you guys all so much for contributing. This isn't where it stops. I want to promise you that, and you can be a part of the next step in the action where we incorporate these ideas. Some of our action projects coming up that I would love for you guys to be a part of. This is more of just a fun event that we like to do to celebrate the holidays. We have a do-it-yourself sustainable gift workshop where we're giving you guys all of the materials to make eco-friendly presents for your friends and family during the holiday season. We have a candle making station, sustainable room sprays, bath salts, tea assortments where you can make your own tea blends, and our newest addition, flower press Mod Podge bookmarks and greeting cards. So it's going to be a really fun event. It is free. We're taking donations as just thank you for getting all this stuff, but it is free. So come out. It's this Friday in this room. And then next Thursday, we're going to make care kits for women in need. We're basically going to be putting together hygiene and information and books and just care into a bag that we're going to be giving out to women at risk, partnering with One Heart Orlando. So shout out to Caroline for putting together that awesome event. And that's it for the rest of the month. But next year, we're going to have a ton of eco-action projects coming up, a ton of tree plantings, cleanup, and so much more. So make sure to stay up to date. I do want to give a shout out really quick to this research program that needs your help. They're basically trying to figure out how much carbon's actually in our atmosphere here in Orlando. So you can come contact them for free. They'll come and put a sensor in your yard. You can ask them to take it out at any point, but they're basically just doing local research and they could really use the help. So go ahead, take a screenshot of this if you want. You can also email me and I'll send you their information. They're going to be our Hive speaker in the summer. So we're going to be able to hear the results of that research that's happening now. So it'd be awesome if you guys could be a part of making that research happen and then come back in the summer to hear what the results were. Awesome. And then that is it for today. Thank you all so much for joining us. Sarah's going to say one more thing really quick. You can come on up, but make sure to follow us on social media. That's really embarrassing. This should say Orlando. But we also have a Tampa branch. But yes, so follow us on everything. We have a lot of stuff that caters to everybody, but you guys are what makes this organization alive and gives us the solutions that we're looking for. So thank you all for being here. But Sarah, I'll give it over to you.
I just wanted to let you know I am going to open our thrift shop for sustainable shopping if you would like to shop. It's all through here. Christmas presents, yeah, you're welcome. And we're having a pop-up market on December 12th, December 11th, Saturday, December 11th, which is a lot of local artists, sustainable artists, not all of them, but some of them are. And that's a great opportunity to really shop local and stay out of the dollar store or whatever. I don't know. Not that you would get Christmas presents at the dollar store, but anyway. So just wanted to let you know that I'm happy to open that up for everybody.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Please grab a cookie on your way out. Goodbye, online. Kristen signing off.